What was supposed to be a routine diplomatic discussion quickly turned into a fiery showdown inside the Oval Office on February 28, 2025. U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sat down to talk about a critical minerals deal. But instead of shaking hands on an agreement, they clashed over war, diplomacy, and trust. Their relationship has been rocky for years, dating back to a controversial 2019 phone call that played a major role in Trump's first impeachment. But tensions between the two leaders have only grown worse in recent weeks, especially over their starkly different views on how to handle Russia. Trump has been pushing Ukraine to make compromises with Russia, hoping to speed up peace talks and put an end to the drawn-out war. Zelensky, however, isn't convinced. He's deeply skeptical of any deal with Moscow unless the US provides solid security guarantees. After all, history has taught him that Russia doesn't always keep its promises. On top of that, the US and Ukraine have been trying to hammer out a minerals trade agreement, an issue already tangled up in politics and power struggles. With so much at stake, their meeting in the Oval Office was bound to be intense. But no one expected it to spiral so fast. What started as a diplomatic discussion quickly turned into a full-blown argument. Vice President J.D. Vance, sitting beside Trump, tried to steer the conversation toward diplomacy, saying, "The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy." Zelensky, unimpressed, shot back, "What kind of diplomacy, J.D., are you talking about?" He wasn't about to accept vague solutions when Ukraine's survival was on the line. Things escalated when Vance accused Zelensky of being ungrateful for America's support. "It's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media," he said, frustration clear in his voice. Then came an even sharper criticism, one that struck at the heart of Ukraine's war strategy. "You guys are going around forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems," Vance claimed. Zelensky didn't back down. But before the tension could ease, Trump himself jumped in, accusing the Ukrainian leader of putting the world at risk. "You're gambling with millions of lives," he warned. "You're gambling with World War III." And just like that, the meeting collapsed. At one point, frustration spilled over. Trump, unimpressed with Zelensky's stance, leaned back and said, "We've supported you more than most people even think we should have." His words hung in the air, heavy with frustration. As the tension mounted, Trump abruptly ended the meeting. "I think we're done here. This is going to make great television," he remarked, signaling that the discussion was over. Security was then called in, and Zelensky was politely but firmly escorted out of the White House. The highly anticipated minerals deal that was supposed to be signed left in limbo. While Trump and Zelensky clashed on multiple fronts, one key reason the U.S. remained interested in Ukraine was its vast supply of critical minerals, the kind needed for high-tech industries, renewable energy, and national defense. Ukraine is home to some of the world's most valuable resources, including rare earth elements like neodymium, lanthanum, and cerium, used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Lithium, a crucial material for electric vehicle batteries. Titanium and graphite, essential for aerospace and military applications. Uranium, a key component in nuclear energy. These resources are a big deal because they power modern technology, fuel innovation, and play a crucial role in global supply chains. Trump wasn't just after these minerals for economic reasons. He saw them as a way to reduce America's reliance on China and Russia, both of which dominate the global supply of rare metals. Take antimony, for example. This rare metal is critical for advanced military technology, and nearly all of it comes from China and Russia. When China recently cut off exports, prices skyrocketed to a staggering $50,000 per ton. Meanwhile, the U.S. military had only enough reserves to last 17 days, a dangerous position for national security. One company, Military Metals Corporation, is working to address this shortage. Their mine in Slovakia contains over 60,000 tons of high-grade antimony, worth more than $2.5 billion at today's prices. Originally mapped during the Soviet era, this deposit is now being developed into a modern resource that could help secure supply chains in the West. While the political world was busy dissecting the fallout from the Trump-Zelensky clash, another war, one that isn't fought with tanks or missiles, was brewing behind the scenes. It's a battle over antimony, an unassuming but essential metal that could determine the future of global defense, energy, and technology. America is dangerously dependent on China and Russia for its supply of antimony, a metal used in everything from armor-piercing bullets to semiconductors and missile guidance systems. Nearly 100% of the world's supply is controlled by Beijing and Moscow, and when China recently halted exports, prices exploded to $50,000 per ton. Now, the Pentagon and NATO are in a frantic race to secure domestic supplies before it's too late. That's where Military Metals Corporation comes in. The company owns 2 past-producing antimony mines in North America, including the West Gore mine in Canada, which still holds valuable surface piles of ore from previous extractions. With the US government actively seeking alternative sources, speculation is mounting that Military Metals could receive massive backing from Washington, making it a potential game-changer in the global antimony crisis. Investors are beginning to wake up to this reality. Whoever controls antimony controls a major part of modern warfare and high-tech industries. The question now is, who will seize the opportunity before the rest of the world catches on? The Oval Office showdown between President Trump and President Zelensky wasn't just a domestic political spectacle, it set off a chain reaction across the globe. For European leaders, the meeting confirmed their growing fears that the US was stepping back from its traditional role as Ukraine's strongest ally. Some leaders had quietly worried about Trump's stance for months, but now it was out in the open. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer wasted no time reaffirming the UK's unwavering support for Ukraine. He assured Zelensky that Britain stands with Ukraine, regardless of Washington's position. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, publicly praised Zelensky's handling of the confrontation, calling him a symbol of Ukrainian bravery. Be strong, be fearless. Ukraine will never be alone. Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, took things even further, openly questioning whether the US was still the leader of the free world. She urged Europe to step up and take charge, declaring, "The world needs new leadership. It's time for Europe to rise to the challenge." Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson both voiced strong support for Ukraine. Kristersson pointedly reminded the world that Ukraine's fight isn't just for its own survival, it's for the security of all of Europe. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also weighed in, vowing that Canada remains fully committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, regardless of what happens in Washington. In short, European leaders were closing ranks behind Zelensky, preparing for the possibility that Trump's White House may not be a reliable ally in the near future. Back in Washington, the fallout from the Oval Office confrontation split American political leaders down the middle. Republicans rallied behind Trump, arguing that Ukraine had taken too much U.S. support for granted and that Zelensky needed to be reminded who was in charge. Some even suggested that it was time for Ukraine to either accept U.S. terms or find new backers. House Speaker Mike Johnson didn't hold back. He suggested that Zelensky should either return to the table with a more appreciative attitude or consider stepping down as Ukraine's leader. America's generosity has limits. The days of being taken advantage of are over, he declared. Several conservative commentators and senators echoed Johnson's sentiments, questioning whether continued military and financial aid to Ukraine was in America's best interest. Some called for tighter conditions on any future assistance, while others suggested it might be time to rethink the U.S.'s role in the war altogether. Meanwhile, Democrats and foreign policy experts were sounding the alarm. They warned that the Oval Office fallout played right into Putin's hands, arguing that Trump had weakened Ukraine's position and given Russia a strategic advantage without firing a single shot. Democratic leaders in Congress expressed deep concern over Trump's behavior, calling it reckless and short-sighted. Some accused him of undermining U.S. alliances and damaging America's credibility on the world stage. Former national security officials also weighed in, warning that if Ukraine loses American support, it could drastically shift the war in Russia's favor. Some pointed to the disastrous consequences of abandoning allies mid-war, drawing historical comparisons to past conflicts where sudden U.S. policy shifts had left nations vulnerable to aggressors. The clash between Trump and Zelensky had exposed a fundamental split in U.S. foreign policy, one that could determine the future of both Ukraine's war effort and America's global leadership. What started as an explosive Oval Office showdown between Trump and Zelensky has now triggered a wider international split, one that could reshape the future of Western alliances. As the dust settled, U.S. lawmakers found themselves locked in a heated debate over Ukraine's leadership and America's role in the war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European leaders wasted no time charting their own course, signaling a clear break from Trump's shifting stance on the conflict. Back in the U.S., reactions to the Trump-Zelensky meeting revealed just how divided the country is when it comes to Ukraine. Some Republican senators took a hardline stance, arguing that Zelensky had overstepped and needed to rethink his approach. Senator Lindsey Graham, once a strong supporter of Ukraine, blasted Zelensky for being disrespectful, even suggesting that Ukraine might be better off with new leadership if Zelensky couldn't find a way to work with the U.S. Not everyone agreed. Senator James Lankford pushed back, warning that forcing Zelensky out would throw Ukraine into total chaos and cripple any hope for peace talks with Russia. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer didn't hold back either, calling Trump's approach a gift to Putin and accusing him of actively undermining Ukraine's fight for survival. Senator Bernie Sanders dismissed any talk of replacing Zelensky, calling it a dangerous idea that would weaken Ukraine's democracy and embolden Russia. Meanwhile, European leaders weren't waiting around for Washington to make up its mind. Just days after the Oval Office dispute, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called an emergency summit in London, gathering top European officials to decide their own path forward on Ukraine. The meeting brought together French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, all key players in Europe's response to the war. The message was clear. Europe would not be swayed by Trump's wavering support for Ukraine. Instead, leaders pledged to increase military aid and financial backing to Kyiv, ensuring that Ukraine could continue its fight, even if American support became uncertain. The speed and urgency of the meeting sent a strong signal. For the first time in decades, Europe was moving independently from Washington on a major geopolitical crisis. The high-stakes gathering wasn't just about rhetoric. It produced concrete actions aimed at strengthening Ukraine's position. Britain pledged a massive £1.6 billion, $2 billion export finance deal, enabling Ukraine to purchase over 5,000 air defense missiles, a direct boost to its war effort. European leaders reinforced their commitment to Ukraine's defense, making it clear that they would not follow Trump's lead in reconsidering military support. The summit also emphasized economic partnerships, ensuring that aid wouldn't just go toward weapons, but also toward rebuilding Ukraine's economy, something critical for its long-term survival. As tensions over Ukraine's future deepen, Europe is stepping into a leadership role, one that could reshape how the West handles global conflicts. In a bold move, the UK and France have proposed leading a new coalition, bringing together countries willing to provide direct security guarantees for Ukraine. Unlike past diplomatic efforts, this initiative isn't just about sanctions and statements. It could involve boots on the ground to enforce a potential ceasefire and deter future Russian aggression. This shift marks a turning point in Europe's approach to the war. No longer waiting on Washington's approval, European leaders are moving ahead with their own plans, emphasizing the need for greater military readiness and independent security strategies. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, highlighted the need for a stronger, self-sufficient European defense strategy, reinforcing the idea that Europe can no longer afford to rely solely on the U.S. for protection. Leaders across the continent agreed that increased defense spending was a priority, not just for Ukraine, but to fortify Europe's overall security against potential future threats. These decisions reflect a broader shift in Europe's role on the global stage, signaling a more proactive and united approach to handling crises without waiting for the U.S. to take the lead. The fallout from Trump and Zelensky's Oval Office confrontation was more than just a tense diplomatic moment. It highlighted a growing divide between the United States and its European allies. For decades, Europe depended on U.S. leadership in matters of defense and international security. But with Washington sending mixed signals on its long-term commitment to Ukraine, Europe is rethinking that relationship. European leaders are no longer just reacting to U.S. policy shifts. They're creating their own strategies to secure Ukraine's future. The proposed coalition of the willing is just one example of how Europe is working to develop independent security measures, moving beyond NATO's traditional framework. The expansion of the Weimar Triangle, originally a cooperation between Germany, France, and Poland, now includes the UK and additional European nations, forming a new bloc focused on military and strategic planning. These developments suggest a significant recalibration of the transatlantic relationship. Rather than relying on Washington's leadership, Europe is forging its own path, one that prioritizes regional stability over political shifts in the US. Over the past few weeks, tensions between Washington and European capitals have only intensified. President Trump's administration has taken a hardline stance, making decisions that have frustrated and alienated key allies in Europe. This widening gap raises critical questions. Is this the beginning of a new era in global power dynamics? Will Europe emerge as a stronger, more independent force in security and defense? And what does this mean for America's influence on the world stage? The once solid relationship between Europe and the United States is now under intense pressure. A series of controversial decisions from Washington have forced European leaders to rethink their approach to trade, diplomacy, and security, leading to what some are calling the most significant rift in transatlantic relations in decades. In early February 2025, President Donald Trump stunned European leaders by announcing steep tariffs on European imports, arguing that America had been treated unfairly in trade deals. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen didn't hold back, warning that Europe would respond with strong and immediate countermeasures if the tariffs went into effect. Former European Council President Donald Tusk went even further, mocking Trump's decision as a pointless and self-destructive trade war. This aggressive trade stance has fueled concerns that the world's two largest economic blocs, the US and the European Union, could be on the brink of a full-scale economic conflict. But trade wasn't the only issue pushing Europe and America further apart. In a shocking move, the US administration deliberately excluded European representatives from ongoing peace negotiations on Ukraine, signaling a dramatic shift in how Washington views its allies. A senior U.S. envoy confirmed that European diplomats would not be included in the discussions, a decision that stunned and angered European leaders who had played a critical role in supporting Ukraine since the start of the conflict. EU officials expressed deep concern, warning that a US-led peace process without European involvement would fail to reflect the interests of the region and could even weaken Ukraine's position in the long run. This exclusion has deepened the sense of mistrust between the US and its European allies, raising serious doubts about Washington's long-term commitment to transatlantic cooperation. Adding to the diplomatic turbulence, President Trump revived an old and highly controversial idea, expressing interest in purchasing Greenland, an autonomous region under Denmark's control. The reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Polls showed that 85% of Greenland's population opposed the idea, and Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen dismissed it outright, calling it absurd and not up for discussion. This bizarre move soured US-Danish relations, reinforcing concerns among European diplomats that Washington's foreign policy was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Meanwhile, tensions escalated further at the Munich Security Conference, where U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a speech that sent shockwaves across European capitals. In a departure from past U.S. leadership, Vance criticized Europe's democratic institutions, urging leaders to engage more with nationalist and populist movements. European officials were visibly stunned, with one high-ranking diplomat commenting that it was the first time in years that an American leader seemed to openly challenge Europe's core values. Faced with a dramatically shifting U.S. foreign policy, Europe is rethinking its long-term strategy. Rather than relying on Washington, some leaders are pushing for greater autonomy in matters of defense, trade, and diplomacy. French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz have called for Europe to take greater control of its own security, reducing reliance on U.S. military support. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has stepped up engagement with European allies, coordinating with France on new security measures to bolster Ukraine's defenses. These moves indicate a fundamental shift. Europe is no longer waiting for U.S. leadership, but is instead forging its own path on the global stage. As Washington's foreign policy takes unpredictable turns, Canada and the European Union have been quietly strengthening their ties, building a trade and security alliance that could reshape the balance of power in the West. For years, Canada's economy was closely tied to the United States. But as tensions with Washington heat up over tariffs and trade policies, Canada has been looking elsewhere for stronger partnerships. Since 2017, the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, has been driving this shift, fueling a 65% surge in trade between the two economies. The EU is now Canada's second largest trading partner, handling over 8% of Canada's global trade, a number that's steadily rising as both sides look to reduce their reliance on the U.S. market. In 2021, Canada and the EU signed a raw materials partnership, securing a more stable supply chain for essential minerals and further diversifying their trade networks. These moves highlight a growing trend. Nations that once depended heavily on the United States are now hedging their bets, preparing for a future where Washington's leadership is no longer guaranteed. If economic shifts weren't already straining relations, President Donald Trump's latest comments added fuel to the fire. During a recent trade dispute, Trump suggested that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state to avoid tariffs. The remark sent shockwaves across Canada, sparking fierce backlash from government officials. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau dismissed the idea outright, calling it a ridiculous distraction from real trade issues. British Columbia Premier David Eby accused Trump of using economic threats as a pressure tactic, warning that Canada would not be bullied into submission. The real battle isn't just about words, it's about money, jobs, and the daily lives of millions. The Trump administration has threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian imports, a move that could cripple businesses, drive up prices, and disrupt trade flows between the two countries. Border towns in both Canada and the U.S. are bracing for impact, fearing that increased costs could devastate local economies that rely on cross-border trade. Canadian leaders aren't waiting for Washington to change course. They're aggressively strengthening economic ties with Europe and Asia, creating new trade routes to reduce their dependence on the U.S. Canada isn't the only one reconsidering its relationship with the U.S. For decades, Europe counted on Washington, not just for military protection under NATO, but also for economic leadership and diplomatic influence. But Trump's shifting policies and diplomatic snubs have sent a clear message. Europe can no longer assume the U.S. will always be in its corner. From being shut out of key negotiations on Ukraine to facing sudden tariff threats, European leaders are realizing that their reliance on American leadership is no longer a safe bet. In response, the EU has begun expanding its alliances, working closely with Canada and other global partners to build a more self-reliant future. This changing dynamic isn't just about trade, it's about power. France and Germany have been leading efforts to strengthen Europe's military and economic autonomy, aiming to reduce dependence on Washington. The UK, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, has re-engaged with European security matters, working alongside France on a joint initiative to reinforce Ukraine's defenses. Canada, once deeply tied to U.S. economic policy, is now pivoting toward Europe and Asia, creating a more diverse and resilient global trade network. These shifts don't mean the U.S. is being abandoned, but they do suggest that America's role as the dominant Western power is no longer guaranteed. The big question now is, will Washington adjust to this changing world, or will it risk losing its closest allies?